The Deep End team acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands on which we work and live, pays respect to elders past, present and future, and recognises the importance of Indigenous knowledge to informing public debate. Welcome to The Deep End, hosted by Marcia Langton and Aaron Corn. Our guest today is the eminent Australian public intellectual, Barry Jones. Barry Jones is a politician, lawyer and writer. He was educated at the University of Melbourne and worked as a public servant and high school teacher before rising to fame as Australia's quiz champion from 1960 to 1968. He became the country's first talkback radio host, then lectured in history at Trobe University before becoming a State Labor MP for Victoria in 1972. Throughout the 1970s, he took a leading role in reviving the Australian film industry. He entered federal parliament in 1977 as the member for Lalor. Between 1983 and 1990, he held the portfolios of science, prices and consumer affairs, small business and customs. He was a member of the Executive Board of UNESCO in Paris from 1991 to 1995, National President of the Australian Labor Party from 1992 to 2000, and Deputy Chairman of the Constitutional Convention in 1998. He has written a number of influential books, the most recent of which is What Is to Be Done? Political Engagement in Saving the Planet, published by Scribe in 2020.
So, welcome, Barry. I'll say a few words of introduction. I'm Marcia Langton, and next to me is Aaron Corn. We're speaking on Wurundjeri and Bunurong country here in the Kulin Nations. We're actually at the wonderful Victorian College of the Arts. And in this podcast series, we are going to interview wonderful people like Barry Jones. So, Barry, you've said that you've been in the Victorian and Australian parliaments for 26 years. Yep. In the 1960s, you were involved with Nugget Coombs and the Council for Aboriginal Affairs, and you became Shadow Minister for Aboriginal Affairs in the Victorian Parliament, and you were in that post from 1973 to 1974, and you've maintained an enormous interest in Aboriginal affairs ever since, and I believe collected some extraordinary Aboriginal art. So I'm going to hand over to Aaron to ask the big question that we want to put to you today.
Well, you've recently put out a new book called What Is to Be Done, correct title?
Yep.
Yep. So I guess the question is, given, the situation in which we find ourselves today, what indeed is to be done?
Well, the main thing, I think, is to be honest with ourselves, to face the fact that Australia began, and rather the Australian settlement by Europeans in 1788 began in rather unpromising circumstances where there were two major elements: the convict system, which was very brutal, and the displacement and dispersal of Aboriginal people. And of course you had from 1788 that concept of terra nullius, the idea to say, well, there's no one around here much, and if they are, they're simply on the move, they're hunter-gatherers, they have no fixed place of abode, they don't do anything very much, they don't have a culture or a history that's worth preserving. And as a result, from 1788 throughout, there was that sense that, well, there are a few of Aborigines around, but a lot of them are going to be eliminated one way or the other, and they'll be the victims of progress. That progress comes along. Europeans come in with their European farming techniques. They carve up the land. They exclude the Aborigines. They use firearms against people who had much more traditional weaponry and so on. And in the end, there was this concept by the end of the 19th century, a concept of the passing of the Aboriginals. And my interest in in Indigenous affairs goes back a good deal earlier. As a child, I mean, I was a kind of smart-ass child, but I did read very fast and read very passionately. And I remember as a kid reading a book which now perhaps doesn't mean people born in the 21st century, but to a lot of people who were born in the previous century, like me, or Gareth Evans is another good example. Hendrik van Loon was somebody who taught us a lot about the world. And he had a very interesting chapter about Australia, but he painted a rather bleak picture of the whole nature of colonisation, that colonisation was invariably brutal. And I remember this image that he appears, which is worth preserving. There's a very powerful cartoon, because one of the things with Van Loon was he was not only a very good writer, but he had a great gift for doing drawings, or effectively almost like cartoons, but very brilliant. And here you've got a wheat field and you've got black soil, and there you've got a lot of skeletons. And underneath he has the heading, "We have fertilised far too many of our fields in this way." And I remember reading this, and I was probably only about 6 or 7, and he said, talking about the history of Australia, said, "The manhunts with horses and dogs organised to exterminate the Aborigines of Australia are rarely mentioned in the histories devoted to the early years of that distant continent. Why go on? I'm merely repeating what everyone knows." Well, everyone didn't know it. The teachers didn't know it. Our history didn't know it. And so the result was that we had a situation where we grew up in a kind of a dream world. But it was only a matter of time before the Indigenes disappeared. Some would be absorbed into the broader European community. Others would simply die off. And that would be a new stage in history. And of course, what's happened is later on in recent decades, you've had the emergence of very powerful leaders going on from the 1960s. And Marcia, of course, is one of the most powerful of all. And you say, we didn't go away, we're here, we have a role to play, we have an extraordinary culture that goes back far beyond 1788, goes back 65,000 years. It's a complex, remarkable experience, and where we know far more from archaeology and so on than we ever did before about the sheer complexity of Aboriginal society. And the result is it's very important that be recognised, that we come clean, that we become honest with ourselves about, just as we need to be quite honest about recognising, that there have always been class structures. Often people like to say we live in a classless society. It's simply not true. Also to say, well, essentially it's a pure white society. I mean, I came across something which is worth looking at. This is a poster that came out, authorised by John Curtin, of all people, in 1916, part of the referendum on conscription. And you see the heading is, "Keep Australia White and Free." And you had the terrible thing about politics as late as the probably almost until the end of the Menzies era, was that sense that the white Australia policy was predominant, and that you had people who dreamt that you could have a continent which was entirely white, something that never happened in history before. And that was a dangerous view, but it fueled the way in which Australian politics operated. That's a very long answer to your very simple question.
I'm also just looking at the bottom of this poster from 1916, And it says, keep Australia white and free, vote no.
Exactly. Well, yes, that's true. Because all you have to do is arouse uncertainty. And part of the tragedy that we have with the referendum of the 14th of October is that compulsory voting means that there'll be a significant number of people who say, look, frankly, I'm not engaged in the issue. I haven't thought about it much. Might be all right, but who am I to make a judgment? So the result is that casting, if they say, but if I have to turn up and vote and I don't fully understand, well, I might just as well vote no.
And John Curtin in 1916 was he the Prime Minister?
No. Not in 1916, no, Billy Hughes was the Prime Minister.
And John Curtin was?
John Curtin was a very powerful official.
In the Labor Party.
Oh,
yeah.
Absolutely. So he's, and of course now we see him as one of the great heroes. But the point is, people of that generation, people born, say, in the 1980s, they took for granted. They took for granted that Australia was for the white man because they saw people who were non-white as threatening the living standards of white workers. And I'm old enough to remember when you used to buy chairs, or used to see chairs on sale, which would be stamped and would say, European labour only. European labour only, because the suggestion was, if you had those Pacific Islanders, people who were called Kanakas, who were brought in, well, they wouldn't necessarily be members of the union, or they mightn't be allowed to join the union. And so they'd be able to work for, very, very modest wages, and that would put pressure on people who were trying to get a living wage for their family. The other thing, to go back, and I'm sorry to be rattling on at such length, but I think it's really got to be said. Back in the 19th century, there was this concept that was called scientific racism. Yes. And some people would say, look, this is not ignorant kind of racism, this is carefully thought through. And to simply say, well, there's a kind of hierarchy of races, and the white Nordic people from the north of Europe, are really at the top of the pyramid, and then you go down and you've got Mediterranean people, then people from the Middle East, then Indians, then Chinese, Japanese, Africans, you go down to, and at the bottom of the pyramid, guess what? Aborigines from the continent of Australia and from Tasmania. And they said, look, this is not something we've made up, it's based on science. Well, it was a view of science, and later on it was given the unfortunate name social Darwinism. Now, that was a very unfortunate name because Darwin himself, it has to be said, was not a person who believed in this hierarchy of races. And in many ways, it was a real steal to get his name and say, oh, well, it's really the scientific thinking of Darwin. He didn't have that view. Darwin's view was we all had the same potential intellectual capacity, and what brought about difference were things like climate, disease, and diet. They were the things that determined whether you were going to live early or late, or whether you were going to really reach maturity, or whether you were going to die in childhood, or whether you were going to die actually as an infant. That's not because there was an innate difference. But in the 19th century, you see, you had this mania. There's a woman called Emily Dietrich, who was called the Angel of Death, who came out to Australia and who collected skeletons. And in some ways, you see, you find European museums are full of Aboriginals because they say they were more interested in Indigenes as specimens than they were as humans. I'm a great fan of Mark Twain, the great American writer, author of Huckleberry Finn. And he had an extraordinary eye. And anyway, Mark Twain came out to Australia in the 1890s, and he was a very shrewd observer, but he always asked very tough questions. And he said to a lot of people, "What happened to the Australian Aborigines? Where are they?" And people just sort of shrugged and said, "Oh, well, they used to be around and they've sort of disappeared." And he said, "You mean you killed them?" And they said, "Oh, well, stuff happens." And so the reaction, it wasn't as if they said, "How dare you, what an outrage." Their reaction when Mark Twain was asking a question was to say, "Yeah, is there a problem?"
And what you're saying now, what you're describing to us, is the milieu in which you grew up. These are all the ideas of your youth, which you inherited. And now I want to know, Barry, what is the relevance of all of those ideas to the present time when we're living through another referendum campaign where the No campaign seems to me selling a dream a bit like the one that you grew up with?
Well, in my own defence, I'll say I'm not that old. I mean, you mightn't think it, but I'm actually less than 150. And I was born in 1932. The Commonwealth had been going for 32 years by then. What it did set was the context of the Constitution. You see, the Constitution is an artefact, to a very large extent, of that period of scientific racism, or as it was often called, eugenics. And if you looked at universities, including the university of which you and I and all three of us are distinguished alumni, you find that with that university, you had people like Richard Berry, who simply said, "Look, we've got to cull people who don't meet our higher standards." And in fact, they had not only were they thought Aborigines ought to be encouraged to get towards the exit door, but they also said they were very much concerned about the feeble-minded. And there was actually a committee on the feeble-minded, and they suggested, you'll find this hard to believe, it is true, Berry suggested that the kind of thing to do with them would be perhaps to gas them quietly, and if you got rid of them, well, that it would strengthen the race, strengthen the white race. What I'm saying is that the Constitution, which Dutton and others keep saying, well, you can't, it's our sacred document. We can't. The Constitution is a perfect example of that mindset of the 1890s. I'm just curious. I mean, I'm fascinated by this. When the Constitution was inaugurated, when the Commonwealth was actually inaugurated at 10 o'clock on the 1st of January 1901 in Sydney, they did it in Sydney as a consolation prize because it wasn't going to be the capital, but in Sydney, they had soldiers from the Indian Army there, but they had nobody from the Indigenous community. Now, it may be that they just never occurred to them to ask. They didn't think about it. But they did have Indians because they wanted to represent the empire and all that the empire meant.
And the present-day debate about the referendum that on October 14, are there similarities with that time?
Well, there's a complete similarity. I mean, the absurdity is the argument to say, look, the Constitution's our sacred document which preserves democracy, which all the values that we have. The point is the people who there's a brilliant thing in The Shovel, which you ought to have a look at on this. The argument being put by people who've never read the Constitution, don't know what's in it. The Constitution, in fact, in reality, the Constitution of 1901 never operated as it was written. You see, if you read the Constitution, which so few people have, and in that brief period I was a lawyer, but I knew the Constitution pretty well. But if you look at that Constitution as it is written, you can see all power is in the hands of the Governor-General. There's no reference to a Prime Minister and Cabinet. There's no reference to the word democracy. There's no reference that says what an election actually does, what follows from the fact that there's an election. And so there's a distinction between what I've called the Big C Constitution, that is the Constitution as a document, and small c constitutional practice, which is the way it's evolved. But, I mean, believe it or not, you see, until 1986, the British Parliament could make laws on our behalf. They could override legislation that we've made in Australia. The Constitution explicitly preserves the right of the sovereign to veto legislation. In Britain, they haven't had an active veto of legislation since 1708. But in the Australian Constitution, it's still there. And so this argument, say, oh, we can't change it. Every word is sacred. It's impossible to change. We mustn't change. Oh, don't do that. And that's what really makes me so infuriated about the lies and the line that's being taken by Peter Dutton and also being pursued, and I think in a most wicked way, by Senator Price.
So the big slogan that we're seeing coming from the No campaign is, if you don't know, vote no.
That is morally absolutely bankrupt. It means that you, as a citizen, you have no right, no responsibility to find out what you're doing. If you don't know, you find out. You ask somebody. You do a bit of reading. You don't simply say, oh, well, I'll back off. I don't want to be involved. The problem is that I think one of the problems that I see, and I've actually written a bit about this, something that's coming out in the Saturday paper, part of the problem is this. The Indigenous community at the moment is 3.8% of the population. And most of the heavy lifting of the campaign is for people like you, Marcia, you and Megan Davis and the two Pats, and you know, a whole number of Tom Calmer, Noel Pearson. You've got the burden of doing it. And unfortunately, and of course, Linda Burney. But that's a very heavy burden because it's not an issue for Aborigines alone. It's an issue for the totality. We've got to get it right. We'll be better people. We'll be better Australians. We'll be better citizens if we're honest with ourselves, look at our history and say we can do better. We've done so well in many issues. I mean, if you think of the 180 nations on Earth, we're in the top 10 in most of the social indicators. A few things we're not doing too well. But on the whole, it's been a remarkable success story. But this area it's unfinished business, long unfinished business.
So let's turn to the referendum question. Yeah. And I'm sure you know that very well, and I'm sure you understand how it essentially consists of two parts: constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples, and part two is by establishing the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government on matters relating to them. So it's in two parts. What do you make of this referendum question? What's your view of it?
Well, you see, look, if I may respectfully correct you on this, you could say there are two elements to the question, but there are not two questions. You see, the two elements, there's only one yes. You don't have yes for one and no for the other. It's the one thing. And that is one of the issues that the opponents, that the advocates of no are pushing to say, oh, well, you might well be in favour of one thing, recognising the role of First Nations in the Constitution, but you draw the line on the voice. It has to be said in Anthony Albanese's favour. I think he's taken the courageous line and the harder line by saying, well, the Uluru Statement from the Heart wanted recognition to be in the Constitution, wanted to be entrenched in the Constitution, so it couldn't just be written out by legislation later on. And I think that was an honourable thing to do, while recognising that it's tougher. It's much harder to get it through by a referendum, requiring that double task of having a majority of the popular vote nationwide and having 4 out of 6 states. Because it would mean, theoretically, you could have every single vote in New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania, and if you only had a whisker of a defeat, of a no vote winning in the 3 other states, then you're toast, even though you might have had, 60% voting yes. And that makes it diabolically difficult. And so I think if he'd gone and said, well, we could do it legislatively, he could no doubt have succeeded. But that it could well be then that the next coalition government, if and when it comes in, could then say, well, we've decided to eliminate it. Actually, there's a paradox which nobody ever talks about, and I don't know whether it's productive or counterproductive to mention it. See, the no case has been arguing and saying, if it's in the Constitution, we can never get rid of it. And nobody's really talking about the case of the Interstate Commission. If you look in the Constitution, there's a specific reference to setting up something called the Interstate Commission, and that had the role of adjudicating on problems where there was an argument between 2 different states. For example, about access to water is the classic illustration. The thing with the Interstate Commission was it never really worked. It wasn't set up. It was in the Constitution from day one. It wasn't actually established till 1912. Never worked pretty well. And after 1920, there was no one on the commission. Whitlam revived it briefly because he thought it could solve some water problems, and Hawke euthanized it in 1983. But it's there in the Constitution. But nobody's saying, look at the way we've been threatened by we can't get rid of the... That's nonsense, because when was the last time you ever heard anyone, a young person like Aaron probably never heard of the Interstate Commission.
I have literally never heard of this.
Well, there you go. You haven't read the Constitution.
Absolutely not.
Well, you've got to.
I do.
You've got to read it between now and October.
Actually, I will. I will have read it about 30 years ago. I did read it. I downloaded the app. There used to be an app where you could download the Constitution, and I have read it.
You've got to.
I have read it, but it's been such a long time since I've read it.
You've got to do better than that, comrade.
I do indeed.
So it's good that you raise the fact that it is one question, and there's, only a yes or no answer to the one question.
Yep.
And I was wrong to put the question in the way that I did. It's not in 2 parts, it's one question. But I really wanted to know what you thought of the question.
Well, I don't see any difficulty with the question. All referenda questions we have in Australia are very simple. It's a simple proposition. And if you look back, for example, when the states agreed to go and form the Commonwealth, a completely new idea for them, completely new idea. They had no experience of federation. There's only a single question. And that implied, and that they didn't call it the Commonwealth of Australia, they called it the Federation of Australia at that stage. But the implication was to say, well, look, maybe you haven't read the 65 pages of the documentation of the whole thing, but be prepared to take it on trust that we want to do the right thing. We want to benefit the Commonwealth, do the best that we can. And so the result is it got carried in 1900, and then that meant by January 1901 they were able to start operating. But I think but if you look at some of the referenda that have been successful in the past, that have been carried, the referendum about social services is a single question. Do you support the Act to change the Constitution to put in a reference to the words social services? Now that was carried, not by all that much, but it was carried, but there's no reference to invalid pensions, to to Medicare, to health benefits, to dental benefits, and all the other things. You could have a list of 20 things that are implicit in it. Which of those things are mentioned in the question in the 1958 referendum? 46 referendum? None, not one. It's just the broad question, and the formulation. And this is one of the things I find so maddening. The precise form of the voice, the number of people in it, the mode of election, its budget, and so on, that will be determined by legislation. But it's as if somehow, in some magical way, whatever Albanese wants will suddenly become the form of the voice. That's simply not true. It's a lie. Because, in fact, the last time I looked, the government didn't have a majority in both houses. So that means to get the legislation carried, they'll have to negotiate. And if no is defeated and we get a yes result on October the 14th, which I fervently hope, Dutton will then have a responsibility to either walk away and say we don't have anything to do with it, we won't vote, we'll let it go through by default, or they'll say we want to negotiate, we want to be part of, to say this is how the voting will go on, this will be the limit to the budget, this will be, and so on, all the rest of it. That's the way they've got to do it. And they won't say it. They won't say it. And the point is you cannot operate. There's a debasing of the whole political system if we take it for granted that people are lying all the time. It's the failure, it's the threat to the system, it's the Trumpian element that's changed. You see, in some ways, the extraordinary thing about what the damage that Trump has done to the whole democratic process is to say evidence doesn't matter. It's the way you feel. And don't worry about evidence. And in fact, if you produce evidence, they say that's fake news. That's fake news. So you just make stuff up. And that's what I find so appalling. In that long period that I was in state and federal parliament, I gave hundreds of speeches. I was a very frequent speech maker. Too many, my colleagues thought, but I worked, but the point was I was obsessive about getting it right. And if I said something and I never gave a speech in which I could have said, in which I would not have been able to say, I can swear an affidavit to say that this material is accurate. And if I made a mistake of some sort, or I accused somebody incorrectly, I was very careful to correct it. I'll just give you one example for a minute. When the first ombudsman was set up in Victoria, they appointed a guy called J.V. Dillon, who'd been a very tough guy in the department in the Chief Secretary's department, and who'd been a master at obfuscation and hiding material and secrecy and so on. And when Dick Hamer appointed him as ombudsman, I described it, not very originally, as the worst appointment since Caligula made his horse a consul. But I was totally wrong, because when Dillon when he changed his role and was ombudsman, he knew all the way the game works better than anyone. And the result is, you see, if somebody dared to do what he had done regularly as when he'd been the Secretary of the Department, Dylan would ring up and say, you get that file to me. I know where it is. You get that file to me. If you're not, I'll report you directly to the Parliament. And I made an apology, which he was very grateful for, and he said his son told me that he carried the apology around in his wallet because I wanted to get it right. But nobody cares whether it's right. They just make stuff up.
These days, yes. So speaking about some of the lies coming from the other side of politics, you've been around for long enough to know that there was a pact of bipartisanship between the Labor Party and the Coalition on Indigenous Affairs for a very long time. And first it was David Littleproud, I think late last year or early this year, with his brand spanking new opposition spokesperson on Indigenous Affairs, Senator Price from the Northern Territory, and then Peter Dutton, who broke that tradition of bipartisanship, which I think is, personally, I think it's a tragic state of affairs for us and for the country, and I'd like to know how you feel about that.
Well, I think it's appalling. And you see, what happened in the case of Senator Price is that she was the factor that really transformed the National Party, who were, I think, under Littleproud, were sympathetic about doing something. But because the numbers are very close in the National Party, Littleproud was put in an extraordinary situation. That it became very clear that the role that she was taking was, if he repudiated her, it's very likely he'd be out in the leadership and Barnaby Joyce would be back. And from Dutton's point of view, the maintenance of the coalition depended on having the National Party on side. So the result was that the effect that the Senator Price had was powerful. I think by far she's the most significant player on the no side, because it's like those what do you call it, where those blocks fall over? You know, the
domino effect.
Domino effect. You know, she then changed the National Party. The National Party then changed the coalition, and so suddenly any kind of move towards it is important. And worst of all is the fact that she keeps using the word, in fact she used it 4 times, division, 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 division. Who's raising division? Well, she is. She is.
I agree. And I think we both agree then that the politics of the no case are highly expedient and have to do with the electoral welfare of the Liberal Party and the National Party, and naught to do with the actual benefits that the referendum question offers the nation.
Well, the national interest doesn't come into it at all. It's entirely political advantage, keeping the coalition together and relying on... and one of the other factors that's significant, and which hasn't been written about much, is that, in my estimation, there is a hard right vote in Australia, which I would calculate at about 9.5%. And I'm not talking in this case about hard right people within the National Party or the Liberal Party, because in fact that figure 9.5% is a conservative. Well, you know, it's a bigger figure than that. But if you take into account, you know, the line was being taken by Palmer, the line was being taken by Pauline Hanson, and by some of the other small, rather odd, you know, parties which have either, you know, come up through anti-vax or anti-climate change denialists, because in effect they're appealing to the same audience. The point is the coalition know they can't win without the preferences of that 9.5%. They've got to have the preferences of 9.5%. And you may remember that one of the state elections in Queensland, Pauline Hanson's party, believe it or not, actually preferenced Labor in some cases simply because they wanted to put pressure on the coalition to be more responsive and say, look, if you don't do things the way we want, then, we'll vote you out. So they're ruthless in pursuing their own narrow view, which is this nativist view, exactly the view that Trump has brought about and puts democracy under such threat.
We've got 5 minutes. So do you have a question, Aaron?
I have so many questions. For the upcoming referendum on The Voice on the 14th of October, you've already, I think, outlined a lot of what you think and a lot about what you hope for that. What's the one thing you would say to people who are potentially indecisive or might be rethinking what their stance is? What's the one thing you'd say to them as we head into this final stretch of the debate?
Recognise that this is an issue that will have long-term, perhaps permanent consequences and will affect not just the present generation, but generations to come. Because our Australian history indicates that a referendum, once defeated, has never been successful the second time round, so that the argument that often comes up to say, well, we'll bring up part of the material in a new referendum, that's just nonsense. I can understand that people are diverted by other things. They're diverted by, by the problems of related to climate change, to cost of living. Even the Qantas imbroglio has had the effect of diverting attention away from it ought to be. But it's a question of really whether we talk about long-term issues and issues of compassion and understanding and embracing a broader view of what human experience is about. That's the critical thing. We finished.
Yeah.
Oh.
And I think perhaps later we should do part 2.
Yeah, we want to talk to you more.
And you can do an assessment of where we land after October 14th. What do you think?
Yeah.
I think it'd be wonderful because you know Australia's history in such extraordinary detail.
You're like the smartest 150-year-old I know. Thank you so much.
Yes.
It was just wonderful.
Really,
Thank you very much.
Really wonderful.